The air in the jungle was thick enough to chew, a wet, green weight pressing down on Specialist Hayes as he knelt before the tunnel entrance. It wasn't the heat that made his breath shallow. It was the smell, a sickening blend of wet earth, mildewed canvas, and something sharp and metallic, like old blood. This hole, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he exhaled first, was the mouth of the viper. Hayes adjusted the strap of the radio headset, linking him to Sergeant Vargas above, the static a constant, nervous buzz in his ear, infinitely preferable to the silence waiting below. He wore no helmet, just a thin bandana, allowing him to feel the stone and dirt sealing inches above his skull. His only light was the narrow beam of flashlight duct taped to the barrel of his modified M16, the stock shortened, the sling discarded. He confirmed the ammunition count one last time, for spare magazines in his fatigue pockets secured with heavy rubber bands. But the one that mattered, the one currently seated, was marked with a red stripe, his final reserve. One magazine left, a grim tally, a self-imposed psychological barrier. If he had to switch to the red stripe, it meant he was in deep trouble, isolated, and relying on pure adrenaline. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the geometry of the entrance. It had been disguised cleverly beneath a cluster of dense bamboo roots, hidden from both air and ground patrols for months. This wasn't just a rat hole. Vargas suspected it was the central nervous system for an entire NVA battalion operating in the CU Chi corridor. A subterranean factory, hospital, and command post rolled into one suffocating space. Hayes felt the rough edges of the tunnel opening against his bare chest, the earth cool and unforgiving. He carried only what was absolutely necessary: his modified rifle, a .45 sidearm holster rubbing against his hip, 6 blocks of C4 explosive with detonators, and the crushing weight of the mission. "Hayes, Yuri," Vargas's voice cracked through the static, taut and low. Hayes didn't reply verbally. He tapped the microphone twice, the established signal for "I hear you" beginning descent. He took a final, deep breath of the stinking jungle air, a lungful of freedom he knew he might not get back, and slid forward, head first, into the absolute, smothering darkness. The jungle sounds, the buzzing insects, the distant thud of artillery, were instantly muffled, replaced by the sound of his own heart pounding like a trapped drum against the clay wall. The darkness was total, thick, and palpable. He was now officially divorced from the surface war, entering the enemy's silent, patient kingdom. The descent quickly turned into a dizzying spiral of tight turns and vertical drops. Hayes used his elbows and heels to control his speed, the clay walls scraping away the skin on his arms and knees despite his already shredded fatigues. The tunnel was engineered for minimal disruption, snaking downward at a steep angle before leveling out into a crawl space that barely allowed him to flatten his chest against the damp floor. The air quality deteriorated rapidly. It was heavy, stale, and smelled intensely of fertilizer and human waste, evidence of the protracted occupation by the NVA. Hayes learned quickly that the greatest enemy underground wasn't the hidden soldier, but the lack of light and the constant threat of unseen traps. He moved excruciatingly slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping ahead in short, controlled bursts, conserving battery while trying to illuminate every inch of the path. He knew the NVA excelled at internal booby traps. Tripwires attached to fragmentation grenades hung just inches above the floor, or poison punji stakes covered by cunningly disguised floor mats. Every movement was a calculation: weight distribution, hand placement, the subtle shift in the feel of the earth under his fingers. He imagined the invisible enemy watching him, their eyes already acclimated to the dark, patiently waiting for the single moment of carelessness. The silence, when the static momentarily faded, was absolute, the kind of silence that pressed in on your eardrums until they hurt, punctuated only by the wet drip of groundwater filtering through the ceiling. He felt a sudden, sharp panic, the realization of being buried alive, a primal fear that had claimed many good men before the enemy even fired a shot. He swallowed hard, forcing the panic back down, focusing on the rhythmic sound of his own labored breathing. He reached a widened section, a temporary rest stop carved into the wall. He paused to check the humidity gauge on his watch. It was nearly saturated. He keyed the mic, still clear. Entering main artery. Vargas responded instantly. Stay sharp, Rattler. We got movement topside. Could be a feint. Hayes didn't like that. Movement topside meant they knew the Americans were close, which meant they knew he was down here. He shifted his grip on the M16, the metal cold and comforting against his sweaty palm. He had to find a central chamber, plant the charges, and get out before the NVA could collapse the tunnels around him. He resumed his crawl, pushing deeper into the Earth's suffocating embrace. The thought of the one red-striped magazine now sitting heavier in his subconscious, a promise of impending violence. Hayes had been underground for what felt like 2 hours, maybe 3. Time warped in the tunnels. Minutes stretched into eternity when navigating a tight turn, and hours vanished in the monotonous rhythm of the crawl. He identified 3 distinct turnoffs, all smaller escape or storage passages, but pressed on, following the main, deeper trajectory. The humidity had peaked, and now the tunnel walls felt slick, the air thick with mineral dust. Then the smell changed. The metallic tang of blood was still present, but now overlaid with the distinct, acrid scent of kerosene and stale cooking oil, the unmistakable sign of a long-term encampment. He slowed to a snail's pace, moving only during the lulls in the dripping water. He reached a cavern. It was vast by tunnel standards, perhaps 20 feet wide and 8 feet high, illuminated faintly by slivers of moonlight filtering through a distant, brilliantly disguised ventilation shaft high above. This was the command hub. There were crude wooden desks, maps pinned to the walls, written in Vietnamese, indecipherable to Hayes, and empty rice sacks piled high. He had found his target. He quickly moved to the deepest section of the cavern, selecting a load-bearing pillar that looked structurally unsound. Working entirely by muscle memory and the narrow beam of his light, he strapped the C4 blocks securely, placing the timed fuses for a 10-minute delay. The goal wasn't just to demolish the chamber, but to cause a cascade failure, burying the entire network under hundreds of feet of red clay. Mission parameters fulfilled. He pulled the arming wires, the fuses humming faintly, their internal mechanism counting down his escape window. He keyed the mic, his voice a dry whisper. Charges set. 10 minutes. Extracting now. Vargas confirmed the message, urging speed. As Hayes turned to retrace his path, the small, almost imperceptible sound hit him. It wasn't the settling of earth, nor the drip of water. It was a shallow, ragged intake of breath, incredibly close, coming from a darkened recess just behind a map wall. Hayes froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, silencing the world around him. He hadn't seen a secondary exit. He hadn't heard the NVA approach. He realized with sickening clarity that he wasn't alone now. He hadn't been alone the entire time. They had let him walk past them, watched him plant the explosives, content to let him seal his own fate before launching their counterattack. The ambush wasn't waiting at the exit. The ambush was happening right here, right now, in the silence and the dark he thought he controlled. The response was instantaneous and brutal. Before Hayes could even raise his M16 fully, a shadow detached itself from the recess, armed with an AK-47, the barrel mere inches from his head. Hayes reacted instinctively, throwing his body violently to the left, the muzzle flash erupting in a deafening, blinding white sphere that momentarily vaporized the darkness. The 7.62 millimeters round whizzed past his ear, the concussion momentarily deafening him in that tight space. Hayes scrambled, abandoning the M16 momentarily to draw the heavy .45 pistol from his hip. He didn't aim. He couldn't. He fired 3 quick rounds toward the spot where the muzzle flash originated, relying on sound and proximity. A wet, guttural cry confirmed the hit, but the sound of that single engagement acted as a flare, triggering the main attack. From 4 different auxiliary passages, bursts of automatic fire erupted, tearing into the clay walls where Hayes had just been standing. The cavern became a maelstrom of flying dust, echoing gunshots, and spent brass casings bouncing off the hard floor. Hayes retreated into the main artery, crawling backward, firing the .45 until the slide locked back on empty. He dropped the pistol, grabbed his M16, and immediately switched to the red stripe magazine. The click of the fresh magazine seating home felt like a colossal mistake. The war had just gone critical. He emptied a short burst, pinning down the closest enemy passage, buying himself precious seconds to turn around and scramble for the exit path. But as he looked down the long, spiraling tunnel he had just traversed, he saw the flickering, dancing light of oil lamps and heard the frantic shouts of Vietnamese. The NVA had sealed the main tunnel with fresh reinforcements. He was trapped between the detonating C4 behind him and a reinforced line of enemy soldiers ahead. The sound of the countdown timer, once a promise of relief, now thrummed in his mind, urging him toward inevitable burial. Hayes pressed his body flat against the ground, the sound of the enemy closing in deafening. He had one magazine left, less than 20 rounds, and he was alone, cornered in the deepest, darkest part of the enemy's lair. Hayes retreated into a small, irregular alcove used for ammunition storage, pulling a crumbling canvas tarp over himself to break up his outline. He pressed the heel of his hand against his left side, wincing. A shard of shrapnel from a near miss, perhaps a stray round striking the clay, had opened a deep, searing gash just below his ribs. It wasn't life-threatening yet, but the wet warmth of the blood soaking his fatigues was a constant reminder of his vulnerability. The gunfire had stopped. The air settled, thick with the sulfurous scent of cordite. Now came the worst part, the waiting. The NVA knew he was wounded and low on ammunition. They didn't need to risk a frontal assault. They merely had to wait for the C4 to do its job, or for him to make a desperate, fatal mistake. The silence returned, more terrifying than the noise. He could hear the faint scuffling of their boots, the metallic rasp of an AK being cycled, the low, unintelligible whispers of the patrol hunting him. He checked the magazine again, running his thumb over the remaining rounds, maybe 12 left. He needed every one of them to count. The C4 was still humming, the vibration traveling through the earth into his chest, counting down the 10 minutes that now felt like 10 seconds. He pulled the radio mic to his lips, his voice strained and quiet. "Vargas, I'm pinned. Entrance is sealed. They're waiting for the blast to collapse the tunnel." Vargas's voice was laced with static and panic. "Rattler, get out of there. You have 3 minutes left. Get clear of the charge." Hayes knew he couldn't. Moving meant exposure. His focus shifted from the immediate enemy to the ticking clock. What was the measure of a soldier's duty? To complete the mission, even if it meant certain death? He had done that. The command post was set to blow, but the secondary directive was survival. The bonds forged in the furnace of jungle warfare transcended mere orders. It was about getting back to Miller, to Vargas, to the few men who understood the depth of the shared terror and trust. Hayes felt a wave of profound disillusionment wash over him. This wasn't the glorious fight they promised him in basic training. This was claustrophobic, dirty, lonely attrition, measured in inches of clay and drops of sweat. He thought of the thousands of men who died in this invisible, subterranean war, men whose final moments were spent crawling in the dark, whispering goodbyes to the unfeeling earth. It made him wonder, when the dust settles and the records are written, who truly won this war? The soldier who died charging up a hill in daylight, or the one who suffocated silently, miles from the sun, buried by an enemy he never saw? He wanted to know what the audience watching this story, who perhaps have faced their own moments of absolute isolation and terror, truly believe. In moments of utter despair, when a mission conflicts with survival, where do you find the line between duty and self-preservation? Share your thoughts below. This question, pulled from the grim reality of a situation, momentarily distracted him, giving him the mental fortitude to grasp the heavy shovel head lying near the alcove, preparing for the inevitable close-quarters engagement. above ground. The situation had deteriorated rapidly for Vargas and the rest of the squad. The feint Vargas had mentioned materialized into a full-scale harassment fire from the tree line, pinning down the extraction route and preventing any direct intervention at the main tunnel entrance. The realization that Hayes was trapped and the C4 was active hit Miller the hardest. Miller was Hayes' spotter, his connection to the light, and now that light was dimming. Vargas, a pragmatic man hardened by 3 tours, pulled Miller aside, shouting over the incoming small arms fire. "We can't dig him out, Miller. Not in 2 minutes. And if that C4 goes, he's pulp." Miller's eyes were frantic. "Sarge, we have to do something. He's running on fumes down there." Vargas grabbed the map pouch, spreading out a wrinkled, highly classified captured sketch of the tunnel system. It was crude, drawn in charcoal on rice paper, but it showed a secondary, older ventilation shaft approximately 150 meters due west of their current position. This shaft was not designed for troop movement, only air, but desperation had stripped away prudence. "This," Vargas stabbed the paper with a muddy finger, "is our only shot. It's a suicide run, but if he's close enough, you might be able to create a diversion, draw the tunnel rats off him. If you hear the C4 detonate, you turn around and haul ass, understand?" Miller nodded grimly. He rechecked his gear, grabbing a pouch of smoke grenades and a coil of heavy nylon rope. The secondary entrance, if it existed, was likely defended by wire, traps, or worse, heavily armed guards. It was a massive gamble, based on the accuracy of a 15-year-old NVA Scouts crew drawing. But Miller wasn't thinking about the risks. He was thinking about Hayes, alone in the dark with a single magazine and a ticking bomb. He felt the immense weight of the bond they shared, a silent, visceral connection forged during a monsoon ambush 6 months prior, where Hayes had pulled Miller out of a mortar crater. That debt was being called in now. Miller took off at a low crouch, moving through the dense elephant grass and secondary jungle, the sound of the firefight at the main entrance fading behind him. He carried the squad's hopes and the faint, terrible knowledge that he might only arrive in time to recover a body. Hayes heard the NVA patrol entering the chamber behind him. Their movements were cautious, low, and expert. They weren't rushing. They were sealing the trap, moving into position for the final execution. The countdown clock in his mind registered less than 60 seconds. He knew the C4 blast would likely seal the cavern entrance, but the resulting shockwave might not be instantly fatal to the soldiers in the tunnel behind him, only immobilizing them. He had to assume they would survive the initial blast and continue the hunt. His only path was deeper, following an unknown, unmapped passage that branched off from the alcove he was hiding in, a desperate, reckless blind chase into the very heart of the complex. He didn't want to die pinned against a wall by the blast. He wanted to die moving, fighting, forcing the enemy to earn every inch. He slipped into the narrow side shaft, dragging his rifle, the shovel head held ready in his offhand. The passage was even tighter than the entrance tunnel, forcing him to move only on his belly. He could hear the enemy whispering in the command cavern, their voices now very close. He moved forward, inch by painful inch, scraping his already raw skin on the sharp stones. Suddenly, the passage opened into a large, cold chamber that smelled of chemicals and old leather. This was a storage depot. As his flashlight beams swept across the room, it illuminated shelves stacked high with medical supplies, disassembled machine guns, and large metal drums of fuel. And directly in front of him, blocking the center of the room, stood an NVA soldier inspecting a stack of bandages, his back turned. The enemy soldier, armed with an ancient Soviet rifle, never heard Hayes. The damp earth muffled the sound of the crawl. Hayes dropped the M16. He didn't risk a gunshot that would alert the entire tunnel system. He moved with the savage, silent economy of a predator, propelling himself forward and slamming the steel shovel head down onto the back of the soldier's neck with all his remaining strength. The sound was a wet, sickening crack, instantly silencing the man. Hayes retrieved his M16, heart pounding, adrenaline masking the pain in his side. The confrontation had confirmed two things. He was deep inside the operational core of the base, and he was still capable of killing silently. He moved past the fallen soldier, driven by the urgency of the blast that was now seconds away, searching frantically for any exit that wasn't the way he came. He just needed to survive the shockwave. The C4 detonated with a muted, subterranean thump that felt more like a physical blow than a sound. The ground beneath Hayes convulsed violently, and the air pressure within the storage chamber spiked, ripping the breath from his lungs. Dust and fine debris rained down from the ceiling. Hayes threw himself behind a stack of fuel barrels, shielding his head, coughing violently as the earth shuddered for what felt like an eternity. When the shaking stopped, the structural integrity of the complex was compromised. The sound of distant, grinding rock and collapsing earth echoed throughout the system. Hayes knew the NVA command post was buried, mission accomplished. But now, the hunt was on in earnest. The remaining NVA underground had one primary objective: eliminate the American who had destroyed their base and seal the collapse. As the dust began to clear, Hayes heard the change in the soundscape. The cautious whispers were replaced by urgent shouts. The NVA knew exactly where he was, judging by the proximity of the blast. He moved quickly, using the confusion to slip deeper into the storage chamber, past the fuel drums, searching for a shaft or a drain. And then he heard it, a sound completely alien to the tunnels, a sound of the outside world cutting through the earth and muffling. The distinct, staccato, crack thump of an American M16 firing on full automatic, followed by the dull, tearing sound of a fragmentation grenade detonating. It was coming from the periphery, definitely above, but close enough that the sound transmitted through the very structure of the tunnels. Miller had found the secondary entrance and was fighting his way in, reversing the flow of the ambush. It was the most beautiful, desperate sound Hayes had ever heard. He keyed the mic, barely audible above the ringing in his ears. "Miller, I hear you. South end of the main storage room, deep. Draw them off." He didn't wait for a reply. The sounds of combat were moving closer, the NVA concentrating their defense on Miller's unexpected entry point. Hayes began to move toward the noise, his last remaining rounds now focused not on escaping, but on reaching his squad mate. Miller's entry had been as reckless and violent as Vargas had predicted. He found the old ventilation shaft disguised beneath a decaying pile of brush, used C4 to blast the rusted grate off, and immediately dropped into a vertical well, his rope scraping furiously against the rough brickwork. He landed in a narrow, choking passage just as an NVA patrol was attempting to flee the main cavern collapse. Miller opened fire without hesitation, emptying half a magazine into the cramped space. The battle was brief, bloody, and decisive. He pulled the pin on a smoke grenade, throwing it down the passage to cover his advance, plunging the tunnels into an irritating, acrid cloud. He knew Hayes was near. He could hear the faint, muffled radio traffic and the distant scrape of movement. He pressed forward, guided by Hayes's whispered coordinates. Hayes, meanwhile, was fighting his way toward Miller. He was running on pure instinct now, the pain in his side a dull, constant throb, his focus laser-sharp on the approaching firefight. He navigated the shelves of the storage room, the light from his rifle beam flashing across faces. 3 NVA soldiers armed with bayonets, trying to flank Miller's entry point. Hayes opened fire, emptying a short, controlled burst of 3 rounds. One dropped instantly, the other 2 scrambling for cover. Hayes fired 3 more, forcing them into a bottleneck. He was down to 6 rounds in the red-striped magazine. He scrambled over a pile of crates and saw Miller. Miller was silhouetted against the blinding light coming from the ventilation shaft above, his M16 blazing, holding a narrow choke point against a relentless wave of tunnel rats trying to push him back. "Miller, left flank," Hayes screamed, using the noise of the M16 fire to cover his voice. Miller glanced over, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, relief momentarily flashing across his eyes. The two soldiers, separated by 100 yards of solid earth and a world of silent terror, had found each other just as the last of the remaining NVA realized they were about to be trapped between two fighting positions. The reunion was the signal for the final, desperate underground battle. The NVA, realizing their escape routes were compromised and their command structure destroyed, launched a coordinated counterattack, attempting to crush the two Americans in the storage chamber. Hayes and Miller positioned themselves back to back, using the overturned crates and barrels as makeshift cover. Miller had been hit in the shoulder, but kept firing. Hayes, using his few remaining rounds sparingly, focused on headshots, ensuring every bullet ended a threat. The sound was deafening. The metallic clatter of the M16s mixed with the deeper, faster rhythm of the AK-47s, the air thick with smoke and fear. Hayes reached down, his fingers finding the familiar shape of his last magazine. It was empty. He was out of rifle ammunition. "Cover me! Out!" Hayes yelled, throwing the useless M16 aside and pulling the discarded .45 pistol from his belt. He was relying on the 5 rounds he knew were likely still chambered. Miller, noticing Hayes' struggle, emptied his own clip toward the main threat, allowing Hayes to pull 2 badly injured NVA rifles from a nearby rack, using them as clumsy shields. The fighting devolved into brutal, close-quarters grappling. Hayes used the heavy weapons like clubs, smashing the barrels against the faces and shoulders of the rushing enemy. Miller, injured but determined, was dragged backward toward the entrance shaft, maintaining suppressive fire. Hayes knew he had to cover their retreat. He turned and fired the .45 twice into the center mass of an approaching soldier, the heavy slugs hitting with a wet finality. The last 3 rounds of the .45 were aimed not at the enemy, but the remaining metal drums of fuel, a final, catastrophic act of demolition. He fired, hitting one drum, then the next. The spark was immediate. The chamber erupted in a flash of orange and black smoke, the intense heat scorching the air. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough to stagger the remaining NVA soldiers and provide the blinding chaos Miller needed to haul Hayes, who was rapidly losing consciousness for blood loss, toward the narrow ventilation shaft, leaving the storage chamber consumed by chemical fire and a suffocating smoke. They crawled, bleeding and deafened, toward the light, their escape bought with the absolute totality of their remaining resources. Every bullet fired, every ounce of strength spent, and the enemy's entire subterranean base reduced to a fiery tomb, sacrificing the chance of finding the deeper network for the immediate necessity of survival. Hayes felt the rope harness tighten around his chest, and then the sensation of being dragged vertically up and out toward the distant, hazy light of the jungle sun, a painful ascent back to a world he almost forgot existed, covered in the blood and dust of the earth he had just conquered and survived.